So with that said, I want to sort of bring an end to the annual report portion of the BMRC annual meeting and begin to turn it over to our BMRC program manager, Allison Sutton. We have 3 of our Archie Motley archival interns who are going to be presenting, and we also have one of our fellows. So Allison, I'm gonna let you just take it away.
Thank you, Marcia. As the BMRC's program manager, I am delighted to lead 2 of our primary educational initiatives. So first, the mission of the Archie Motley Archival Internship Program is to create educational and meaningful internship opportunities for undergraduate, graduate students, and some recent grads as well. Students of color are selected for practical employment experience, and they work with cultural heritage professionals, archivists at one of our BMRC's member institutions across the summer for about 8 weeks. So since its inception in 2016, 18 interns have completed the Archie Motley internship. And I'm including in that number the 3 you will hear from in just a moment. Each will give a brief presentation about their internship experience this summer at one of the BMRC member institutions. And after each speaks, we will have time for 1 or 2 questions before moving on to the next intern. So first, we will hear from Cameron Drake, who is the rising junior at the University of Chicago, where he majors in history and critical race and ethnic studies with a minor in theater performance. Cameron is working on the Documenting Black History in DeKalb County and at Northern Illinois University project. It's a joint effort of the BMRC member institution, Northern Illinois University, and the DeKalb County History Center. Cameron, if you're ready.
Hi everyone, give me 1 second and I will share my screen. So sorry. Not what I'm trying to do. Oh, I just this. Right, let me share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Awesome. Wait, hi everyone, my name is Cameron Drake. I am, as Ms. Sutton said, a rising junior at the University of Chicago. And I was working with Northern Illinois University in the DeKalb County History Center in their Oral Histories project. So just for what I will be going over today, I will be going over editing the oral histories and the thematic elements involved with that. I'll be going over the stories that I had the privilege of hearing and listening to, some final thoughts, and then finally time for questions. So when it comes to editing oral histories, one of the things that I had to do was editing the transcripts. So they used this software called Otter AI, which would have an automatic transcription of any audio that you put into the software. And then I would go in and just edit it for both clarity and just any minor proofreading edits. And so one of the things that I asked my supervisors to do was if they could put them on YouTube as private videos, just because I'm hard of hearing and it would make it easier for me to read their lips rather than rather than listen to the audio. So having that both that audio and visual aspect was very important for me. I also used Premiere Pro to edit some of the videos because the Northern Illinois University and the DeKalb County History Center, this project was a website that they were creating in order to showcase these stories to the public. And we'll get more into that with the thematic elements, but I used Premiere Pro to edit some of the videos together. And this was really important to me because this was a group of Black community members, mainly associated with one of the Black churches in DeKalb. And so getting to tell their story was very important to me. And it was interesting when it came to like editing the transcript versus editing the videos, because they're both ways to tell the stories of Black elders in the Black community, but it made it interesting for me in that it's such a different framework, if that makes sense. There were 4 themes that I had to look out for as I was finding these stories, among others, but the 4 main ones were hope, community, exclusion, and then fear. And at first, I was finding a lot of exclusion and fear stories, but then as I continued, I was able to find I was supposed to find timestamps for hope and stories of community, and it was really interesting hearing stories about these people who had lived these long lives in a sundown town, and their experiences still finding that hope in that community among that exclusion and fear. So without going into too much detail, I heard a lot of stories of resilience. I heard stories of family. I heard stories of community and communion. And I heard stories of connections among community and getting to understand the lives that these people lived. And so it was really interesting because one of the stories that they heard was from this pastor named Reverend Mitchell. And Reverend Mitchell started one of the Black churches in DeKalb County. And his church had been mentioned by basically every story that I had heard prior to his, in every transcription that I had to edit prior to his. But getting to hear his story and have that epiphany moment was a very awe-inspiring moment, because it's like, oh, you're the one that we've all been talking about. And it really shows the significance to me of the impact that Black elders have on the community around them and on the significance of the histories of the stories that we don't always get to hear. So just a few final thoughts. In terms of things that I would do differently personally as an intern, I think I would go through and listen because I was rushing just a bit when I first began. So I didn't get to give as much of a, I didn't get to give as much of the listening ears I would have liked because I was so focused on editing. But I think it's important that we record these oral histories because these are stories that these are stories that don't often get told. And these are stories because they aren't they don't make the newsreel. They aren't a part of the latest academic journal, but I still think these stories are important. And I think these are stories that we should be, stories that we should be recording for future generations. Thank you to the BMRC, to Allison Sutton, my project manager, to Michelle Donahoe at the DeKalb County History Center, and to Drew Grandegree at Northern Illinois University for this incredible opportunity. Questions?
Cameron, had you previously worked with oral histories in any of your previous experiences? And if not, I think, you mentioned software that you were using that might not be familiar. Maybe you could tell us a little something about that.
Yeah, so I am using oral histories for my history thesis, and I was briefly involved in an interview for another BMRC project, the Chicago Black Dance Legacy Project, but I wasn't involved. I hadn't been involved with this aspect of the oral history process until this opportunity. And then I also, the software that I used was Premiere Pro. It's this Adobe video editing software. Was a software that I used to edit the videos. I think it was very helpful for me. And then the software I used for the oral histories was, the software history that the DeKalb County History Center was using was Otter AI.
Thank you. I think we have a hand raised. Wonder Drake, did you have a question?
Oh,
Feel free to unmute yourself.
I think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
The chat is disabled, so that's why I couldn't put in the chat.
Okay.
I wondered if it would be possible with the things you learned to create short TikToks that might appeal to this next generation coming up. Like when I was coming up, we would have converted this to children's books for the children to read, but would it be possible, Cameron, with what you did to do short TikToks on the lives that you listen to for educational purposes and things?
Yeah, for sure. I think using social media is a great and often not an underutilized resource. And I think it would definitely be possible to create TikToks from the stories that we create. A lot of the stories were, I think the shortest story we had was around like a minute, which is just about like the optimum time for TikTok. But with some like simple editing in terms of like, because one of the things that I did was I added a transition in the title slide. And I wasn't able to find the website, unfortunately, in my email. I would put it in the chat. But if I can find the website, I will hope that will be emailed out in the next BMRC newsletter, so that you all will be able to see. But the to answer your question, yes, I do think so. I think it would be a great resource that should be utilized more.
Okay, Cameron, we have another question. Was there something you learned that surprised you during this project?
I think something that, I think in terms of the stories I heard, I think I was definitely surprised, because at least I'm as a history and crest major, and like as someone who fancies themselves a storyteller, I don't always get to see stories of, I feel like at least some of the nuances of like Black community can be lost sometimes. And one of the stories I was able to hear was about how single mothers in DeKalb County would come together and boil hot water anytime there was news of the KKK coming through. And so getting to hear that story of like these people coming together, it surprised me that I hadn't heard anything like it before. And surprised that a story like that isn't more prevalent, if that makes sense.
Okay. I see that we have a couple of additional questions, but because of time, we will need to move on to the next intern. All right. And so let's do that. And so you'll hear now from DAIAN Rodriguez. DAIAN is a rising sophomore at the University of Chicago and majors in anthropology and Latin American and Caribbean studies. So DAIAN is working on the Cook County Historic Archives and Records Office oral history collection at the Cook County Historic Archives. So DAIAN, if you're ready.
Thank you, Allison. Good morning, everyone. I am sharing my screen right now. Here we go. Okay, everyone can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yes, my name is DAIAN Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her. And like Allison said, I'm a rising second year at the University of Chicago. This summer, I had the opportunity, or I've been had the opportunity because I'm still working at the Cook County Historical Archives and Records Office, that's known as CARO, under the wing of the manager of archives, Kyle Hearn. From her, I've learned a lot of what it takes to create and manage an archive. CARO is fairly recent, and I'm so grateful to be part of the initial steps CARO has been taken. To give a little bit of background, the mission statement for CARO is to provide greater knowledge and understanding for county residents and employees of the importance of Cook County's role in the growth and development of the region, state, and nation through the documentation and preservation of county documents and artifacts held by county agencies and offices. So through CARO, I've been able to learn what it takes to create a archive where we have an accurate representation of a community of in this case, Cook County's community, in which as we know, it's not uncommon where history is only told from one point of view, and it has and some communities are underrepresented or misrepresented. So through CARO, we want to change that and have an archive where we can see the history from different points of view. And one way of doing this is through the Oral History Collection Project, which I'm working with. The Oral History Collection Project will document stories from county's residents, city officials, legislators, and in a way of having history through different points of views and through different voices, and where history will not only be told from one voice, but rather from everyone that has played a role in the growth and development of Cook County. The mission statement is the Cook County Historic Archives and Records Office is responsible for compiling the history of county government and explaining the role the county played in the growth and development of the region, state, and nation. And so through the oral history collection project, we're able to document county history through the voices of county residents, cities, officials, and legislators. It's been really interesting of learning how everything that goes through creating an oral history collection, more of creating the methods we want to use of recording these interviews for oral history. In my training, I've learned how to use equipment needed for these interviews, like recorders, microphones, the platforms used to like record these interviews. The development of best practice of oral history guide is the one I've been working with the most, whether it is by watching videos and giving feedback of how useful they were for me to understand the process of how to conduct oral history interviews in order to include them in the guide that we will use as a document, as a script to follow to do these interviews, by preparing questions we want to include in these interviews that we think are important and crucial to have documented, by putting tips and including tips for the preparation of initial outreach and approach for possible interviewees that we want to have in the document, and participating in mock interviews. Mock interviews, it's been a really interesting and nice experience, because I've been able to not only have my experience of an interviewer, but rather as being interviewed. And it's very crucial in the sense of we know what it's like being both positions, and both being the interviewer and the interviewee, and how we want to construct an environment of hospitality and empathy when doing these interviews. When we select someone to be interviewed, this person is telling us their story, and a story that has impacted the growth and development of a county. So we want to make sure this person feels safe when doing these interviews. And by having these mock interviews, we know how we want to lead. Also, these will be recorded and uploaded to the document of the best practices of oral history guide, in a way of having it as also like a script of how we want to follow these interviews. It's been really interesting working at the Cook County Historical Archives Office. And I am really grateful for the opportunity both the Cook County and the BMRC has given me. Thank you. And I will answer any questions.
Thank you, DAIAN. That was great. Questions for DAIAN? Let's see if there's something in the Q&A. Not at the moment. Okay. Well, DAIAN, what can you say briefly anyway about the plan going forward for the work that you've done? What is the immediate plan? I know that this Cook County Historical Archives is really very new, so there's a lot of work to be done. Maybe you can say something about the plan for the specific work, the best practices manual that you developed, etc.
Yeah, so right now we really want to start with this interview, especially focusing more on like legislators and city officials, recording their stories and their and contribution to helping developing in the growth of Cook County, and their projects and their history of their upbringing into their roles and the work they've done as important members of the community.
Wonderful. So I do see a question. Have there been any challenges or limitations with the technology used to document oral histories for this particular project? And that's from Jordan Brunson.
Not really. It's more of making sure we have access to the right equipment, and more of doing research. What is the right equipment to use? What is the most efficient equipment to use? Not any challenges so far that I at least know of. I was trained by Shakira Dunson, who was a consultant for CARO. And she was really helpful by telling me all the tips of what to do. More of, so for example, like if I am doing an interview in person, that I need to have my recorder with me, always have extra batteries, always have a charger, always have backup recorders, in order to always have this, not have any challenges or difficulties when doing an interview. We want to make the interview as smooth as possible.
Okay. All right. So there is one more question in the Q&A, and if you have a moment, you can type an answer for that one, but keeping ourselves on time. So if you can do that, Diane, then we're going to move forward so we can now hear from SYDNIE. And thank you very much, Diane. SYDNIE Martin is a 2022 graduate of DePaul University. She received her BA in African and Black Diaspora Studies with a minor in history. SYDNIE is working this summer on the oral histories of the Black Student Union Project with the Special Collections and University Archives team at DePaul University. SYDNIE, when you are ready.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Like Allison said, my name is SYDNIE, and this summer I've been working with DePaul University Special Collections on an oral history project of the Black Student Union. So a little bit more about the project to begin. So DePaul's Black Student Union was created in 1968 by a group of Black students who felt that they could not fully participate in the university. They released a list of demands they wanted from the university, including a Black counselor, Black faculty, and a class that focused on the contributions of the Black man. A committee on human relations was created to assess the needs of minority students on campus. A counselor was hired, and departments in the university were encouraged to recruit and hire Black faculty. A year later, the Black Student Union released a second set of demands read out loud in the Schmidt Academic Center, which is an academic building on campus. They gave the university 24 hours to respond. These demands were for a halt of DePaul's expansion program, which they saw to be a racist conspiracy to push Blacks and Puerto Ricans out of the area, a Project 300 program bringing 300 Black and Puerto Rican students to DePaul's campus, regardless of transcripts and exam scores. And ultimately, they took over the Schmidt Academic Center for about 12 hours, disrupting classes and starting important conversations challenging DePaul on their attention to Black students' needs. So the goal of my internship was to conduct at least one oral history interview with a former member of the Black Student Union. In order to do this, I started by researching in the collections. I was fortunate to be in person this summer, so I was able to go into the stacks and pull from different collections. Some records had specific folders about matters of the BSU. Some I had to just read through and see if they ever mentioned the BSU or Black students or any of the issues that were happening on campus at the time. I looked through a lot of committee meeting minutes to see what they were discussing, how changes were being made. I looked through the BSU's documents, I looked through their demands and any other records that they had produced during their time. And I also looked through yearbooks and student newspapers, not only to see what was being reported about the BSU and Black students, but also to see what was happening on campus at the time. Since this was a big time for student activism and political involvement. I also did some outside research on the period, just to add context to what was going on nationally, as well as what was going on the campus. My supervisor, Britton, provided me with a lot of material on how to prepare myself for this interview. This is my first time doing oral history, and I didn't know that I was going to be doing oral history coming in, so it was definitely a little bit of a learning curve. But I was able to format some questions, draft some questions, and then we reached out to some people who were members of the BSU. And last Friday, I was able to conduct my first interview with a former member who went to DePaul from 69 to 72. So that's what I've been doing this entire summer. So for the last 2 weeks of this internship, I'm working on the transcription of the interview, cleaning it up, making sure everything is formatted the way it needs to be. And then I will also be working with the oral history metadata synchronizer to get that uploaded as well. So some reflections on my time this summer. So I came in, I just recently graduated from college. So I came in with a career in mind. I knew I wanted to do something working with archives, but I didn't know exactly where I fit with that. I didn't really know what my interest was, or even like what was out there. So I was trying to get more information and experience doing this before I went back to school. So I had to do informational interviews for the for the internship. I also, Allison had set up some guest lectures with different people in different fields, kind of talking about their work, which was super interesting to me to see the different opportunities that are out there. I also got an inside look on the special collection department here at DePaul. I was able to kind of see what people were doing day to day. I was working in the same room with student workers who had their own projects, and I also was working around other archivists to see what they were doing. So it was kind of interesting to see what kind of work was happening in a university archive like this. So that was really cool. And then I also saw the importance of oral histories. Like I said, this is my first time doing an oral history interview or working with oral histories at all. I had studied history a little bit while in school, but we never really touched on oral histories unless it was like a very short debate on whether you can consider it like evidence or reliable, stuff like that. So never really understanding how important it is. And doing the actual interview, I realized that getting these individual perspectives from the people who experience them is so important to add context and extra dimension to what we have back in the archives in our records. So yeah, that was my experience working this summer. I'm really grateful for the DePaul team and also for the BMRC for this opportunity. And I've learned quite a bit. And I kind of am starting to figure out what I'm doing next. So I really appreciate that. But yeah, that's me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sydney. Do we have any questions? If we have even just one question for Sydney before moving along. Let's see, I'm checking the Q&A. No questions coming up. Oh, let's see. Yep, so let's see. Oral histories are so valuable and reliability is a real issue. How do you screen for reliability?
That's a good question. So this project started from an event that was held on campus earlier this year. And I think it was our Black Student Union now, I'm not exactly sure, who brought in former students and they talked about their experiences. I think they brought in the former president and then another person who was really involved. And they had some people to recommend us to interview as well. So I think we kind of just went off that, knowing that these are people that they trust, so we can screen them as well. And yeah, I think that was about it. It really was just the early talking to her before we actually did the interview. We were kind of able to recognize that she would be a really good resource for us in this project.
Okay, so I think Steve has his hand up. Steve Adams, did you have a question?
Yes. I'm curious about your own perspective on what was happening at DePaul 50 years ago. As you experienced DePaul, you were a DePaul student, right?
Yes.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on present DePaul versus DePaul of the past.
Yeah, I came in before I started really looking into the archives, not really knowing how the university was going to be responding to all of this. And DePaul really kind of upholds itself. It has this Catholic mission. It's been such a mission that it helps others and that it's very one to serve the community. And I wanted to see what they were doing back 50 years ago. So it seemed like they really were. And the responses that they had in minutes and in memos that the dean was sending to the president and that faculty were talking to each other, it really seemed that they were trying to work with the BSU to get these demands heard and to work on the needs of Black students, which I thought was super interesting. Because I didn't know if there was going to be backlash or not. And from what I was reading, there really seemed to be a lot of cooperation with the BSU. It was also interesting because there seemed to be a lot of parallel between the BSU that I know today and the BSU that was happening back then. I think like when the protest happened in 2020, our BSU sent out like a list of demands to the university, and seeing them do that for the first time in '68 was really cool to see like kind of the parallels of still how the BSU is advocating for Black students on campus.
Okay, just very quickly from Jamie Nelson, you have a question. Were there any surprises in terms of the content of the conversation, something that perhaps had not been mentioned before or referenced in the existing documentation that came out in the conversation?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, from what I was reading from administrative reports and minutes and stuff like that, it really did seem like the university was cooperating and working to be better for Black students. And then when I interviewed the person who was a former member, it did seem like that. It seemed like the university was cooperating, but it was more so, they didn't have the focus that they necessarily needed. And despite all these efforts that were kind of face value, there wasn't like too much real change, at least in her perspective, that was really happening on campus. So that was really interesting to me because I came in kind of thinking one way, changed my mind because of what the records were saying. And then when she actually was talking about it, it was kind of just like interesting to piece it all together and get a student perspective versus what the administration thought they were doing.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you, Sydney. And a huge thank you again to all three of our Archie Motley interns, DAIAN Rodriguez, Cameron Drake, and Sydney Martin. Thank you so much. So I know that some of you are familiar with our summer short-term fellowship, with the summer short-term fellowship program. But briefly, for those of you who are not, annually, the BMRC offers a 1-month residential fellowship right here in the city of Chicago for the summer short-term fellows. The fellowship program has engaged scholars, artists, writers, and public historians. And the idea in having them here is so that they can conduct research at one of, well,